So we have come a long way in the processor department. 10 years ago, single-core processors were still very common in the market, and multi-core processors just started to creep their way into the market. For instance, Intel released their first dual-core consumer processor, the Pentium D, back in 2005, 12 years ago. AMD introduced the Athlon 64 X2 around the same time to battle the Pentium. Not long after, quad-core processors made their debut and the core wars began. Today, multi-core processors are considered a necessity. Games recommend multi-core processors even if they're not current-gen models, and pretty much any laptop made in the last 5 years has at least a dual-core processor on it, and desktops have even more than that. Some believe that we have reached the point where dual-core processors should be obsolete, even in office solutions, but as of January 1st, 2015, Newegg still had brand new AMD Sempron single-core processors in stock. It's good to note that Sempron 100 series CPUs are actually Athlon 2 dual cores where a single core did not pass inspection. This means that AMD did not purposefully make single-core CPUs back in the mid-2010s. I don't really think anybody was doing that. But while the intention to make the product was not there, the intention to sell it was, and they sold. People bought them mostly for mining rigs and for data servers, but they racked up sales nonetheless. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that single-core CPU eradication from the new market happened a lot later than many people tend to believe, and the same could be said for dual-core CPUs. With all of that being said, curiosity got the best of me. If AMD or Intel released a modern-day single-core CPU today, how would it perform? And would it be okay for regular tasks? I mean, Microsoft only insists on a 1 GHz CPU to run Windows 10, meaning that any processor made in the last 8-9 years would theoretically work fine, but the question here today is how good is fine? How about for 1080p gaming or content creation? With so many questions in mind, I set out on a 5-day journey to experience the single-core goodness myself, and I got some pleasant surprises. In case you guys didn't know, my main rig is an AMD Ryzen R7 1700 overclocked to 3.9 GHz, 16 GB of DDR4 memory at 2933, and an RX 480 8 GB reference. It's a solid computer and packs a ton of multitasking and video editing power, so switching to a single-core CPU was a breath of nasty, dank air. I cannot disable 7 of the 8 cores on my 1700, so instead I set up the i3-6100 rig I used in my Ryzen R3 simulation video instead, went into the BIOS and disabled hyperthreading in one of the cores. Now, I want you guys to bear with me here for a moment. Minus the very obvious simulated single-core CPU, none of my material here would actually be used back in the early to mid 2000s. I mean, I have 8 GB of DDR4 for this setup, I have an SSD, and I have an RX 480 Gaming X, and I have Skylake single-threaded capability. Meaning that if I would have used this setup 10, 12, 13, 14 years ago, it would be one of the highest end computers out at the time. So these components definitely help the single core CPU's narrative, but there are some noteworthy differences that I would like to show you guys between it and the R7 1700. Now, if you guys are interested in something that's a little bit more reflective of the times 15 years ago, then I could do something like a 10 or 15-year-old PC, and I use that as my main rig. Let me know in the comments if you are interested, but for now, just know that this setup is probably the best case scenario that you will ever see with a single core CPU. So, what was life like for a whole week on a single core CPU?
The first thing I tested was boot times, and the results were not super exciting. As many of you know, the storage disks are the main indicator of boot times, and since I didn't change them, the boot time was not noticeably different. I had a 7-second BIOS boot according to Task Manager. Quick, but again, it's not an indicator of CPU performance. So far, so good. Writing papers and office work was smooth for the most part, even when I had 2 windows open. I experienced no lag once everything was warmed up and running, but I experienced hiccups and glitches when starting any application. WPS Sheets had a very black visual glitch when I first opened it, and it took a few minutes to settle back down. I'm sure it took a while to load its resources, but like I noted, it was fine after those initial weird moments. Web browsing was fine. Kinda. I primarily use Chrome on my R7 1700 and I used it here as well, but after 5 to 6 non-multimedia tabs, my computer wasn't having it. Hiccups when scrolling and occasional freezing when switching tabs, no bueno. It got worse when I added multimedia content to the mix. Full 1080p videos were watchable but not without the occasional stutter, especially when scrolling or in full screen. This can get annoying because the audio will also lag behind when the video does, making even casual music and music videos unpleasant. Any resolution higher than 1080p is completely out of the question. Here's a typical 4K video, for example. Lag and stutter ensues. In the case that you have a single core CPU, don't go higher than 1080p, even that resolution pushes its limits. Having more than 2 or 3 multimedia tabs open will result in freezing almost every time.
This leads me into my next segment of the video, multitasking, a horrible chore on this poor component. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. It's not as bad as you think if you keep your expectations reasonable and you understand that you're using a single core for multitasking. In non-multimedia applications, it actually does fairly well. I can have Paint open, Chrome open with a couple of tabs, and a spreadsheet running in the background. The CPU will be fine the majority of the time, but don't expect any breathing room. The processor's usage will be pinned to 85% or above. As soon as I add a video or a multimedia site such as Tumblr or Twitch to the mix, the scenario takes an ugly turn. Multitasking with multimedia is a nightmare. If you have more than 2 multimedia platforms open, such as GIMP and a YouTube video playing in the background, the computer locks up. If you have Chrome with more than 2 or 3 YouTube videos playing, or more than 5 to 6 multimedia sites in the background, the computer locks up. Essentially, if you're going to be using videos, GIFs, or any kind of image-based sites such as Tumblr or Imager, then run them exclusively. Do not have any other applications running in the background, otherwise the computer locks up.
Next up, content creation, specifically video editing. To my surprise, the single-core i3 performed much better than expected, though I can't give it all of the credit, of course. The 8GB of RAM and SSD definitely carried it here, but transitioning from the 1700 to this CPU wasn't awful. The difference was noticeable, but it just felt slower. Not laggier, just slower, especially when I just had my video editor, Sony Vegas Pro 12, open. My workflow experience was not as obnoxious as I had hypothesized. There was some lag in the preview render, but lowering the preview settings fixed it fairly quickly, and it was mostly noticeable during transitions, not during the meat of the clip. It did, however, get bad when I opened other applications I typically use when editing: Chrome, OBS, Audacity, Paint, GIMP, or Spotify. To be fair, that's a multitasking issue, and we already know how bad that is, so I'll save the scolding.
The biggest difference I noticed was definitely render speed. With my R7 1700, it never took more than 15-ish minutes to render a video, and my video parameters were a 7 to 10 minute duration, about 5 to 10 audio and visual tracks total, and I rendered at 1080p 30 FPS. It took this CPU almost 15 minutes to render a 1-minute clip of myself talking to the camera. In order to get the full experience, I edited and rendered my previous video, the $30 PC, with the $70 GT 1030 video using this setup. It took nearly an hour and a half to render the entire thing, and that's with OpenCL, an SSD, and 8GB of DDR4 memory. I'm sure if I used a quote-unquote authentic single-core CPU from the early to mid-2000s, I'd need to leave it running overnight.
The very last metric I tested was gaming, both flash gaming and dedicated gaming. Browser games reached their peak in the mid to late 2000s, but slowly died off as the 2010s hit. A typical computer using a single-core processor would definitely play on these sites such as Miniclip, Newgrounds, or Y8. To sum things up, flash gaming was a breeze. I thought it would be worse, but I frequently forget that I have an RX 480 paired with a CPU, so it would be a shame if the computer couldn't handle browser titles. Raft Wars and Happy Wheels ran perfectly fine as well, no hiccups.
Now for the part that I'm sure a lot of you guys are interested in, and that is dedicated PC gaming. Like I mentioned earlier, I use the single-core CPU in a typical week, meaning that I only played games that I would typically play during a work week. So this game list is not super exciting, and it's very small because I don't game too often during the week, but the games that I tested were SMITE, Overwatch, and PlayerUnkown's Battlegrounds. My expectations going into these games were pretty low, and I believe that they are warranted in all honesty, because the official system requirements for all of these games insisted on multi-core CPUs. So as you can see, going in there with a single core CPU is not the most exciting thing ever.
SMITE took forever to load, and I was getting PUB vibes from my previous video yet again. The god selection screen had lag and stuttering, the system froze right before the actual match launched. All of these bad signs led me to think that the CPU would struggle, but the game was definitely playable. The numbers were low and the CPU was pushed to its limits, obviously bottlenecking the RX 480, but I didn't feel at a disadvantage compared to other players. The same rules applied to Overwatch. The launch was laggy, but the game was playable. Not as smooth as SMITE, but again, I do not feel as though I was at a huge disadvantage compared to other players. The overall experience was still positive. And finally, I tested PlayerUnkown's Battlegrounds. I was only able to play the game properly at the lowest settings. I was rid with awful lag spikes at even medium settings, and while there was still some obvious lag at the lowest settings, it was playable enough to enjoy the game's mechanics and fight other players.
So far, this CPU definitely surprised me. I was expecting a world of hurt using a single core CPU, especially coming from an 8-core 16-threaded CPU in my R7 1700, but honestly, it wasn't too bad. It was definitely doable and I could definitely work with it. I just had to keep my expectations reasonable. So that was my experience using a single core CPU. It was an interesting few days, but I'm definitely glad I got a taste of it. It makes me appreciate my precious 1700 that much more. The difference is vast, but rightfully so. It's a $300 CPU and I basically pitched it against a $100 CPU, and much less if it was sold as a single core variant, probably closer to like 30 bucks. Now there are a few things that I wish I had time to test, such as its performance in legacy applications and games. For instance, instead of using Sony Vegas Pro 12, what if I used an older iteration of Vegas Pro that came out during a single core CPU's typical lifetime? Or would multimedia multitasking be better if I used an older browser or a lighter alternative to Google Chrome? And then there's legacy gaming, like I mentioned. How would it perform in Elder Scrolls Morrowind or Oblivion, for instance, or games such as Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2? I definitely wish I had more time to test these. And then there are comparative experiments that I really wish I had time to test. If I added hyper-threading to the single core, how much of a performance boost would that have? And then how does that compare to adding a full core on there and then adding hyper-threading on top of that dual core? And then there's also things that I could have tested, such as legacy CPUs. How does this single core CPU, modern day, and I use modern day very lightly because of course there aren't any modern day single core CPUs out right now, but how would this modern day single core CPU perform against a Core 2 Duo or a Core 2 Quad that are reaching 10, 12, 13 years old? And then finally, there's the whole thing that I could have used a 10 to 15-year-old PC as my main rig, and how would that compare to this rig right here? So yeah, there are a lot of alternatives to this video. If you guys are interested in an alternative or an extended version of this, then I could definitely do one. Just let me know in the comments below. But other than that, that's it for this video, guys. If you liked it, then leave a like, and if you loved it, subscribe, because I have more videos like this coming out in the future. Really quick announcement before I go. Tonight, Friday, at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I will be streaming on Twitch. I will be playing a few games with some people in my Discord channel. So if you want to play games, then join the Discord and then you can play with us, or you can just watch me on Twitch. Link will be down in the description, 8:30 p.m. EST. So yeah, I'll see you guys there hopefully. Until then, I'll see you guys later.